How do we draw with ink to get drawings that look as though they were drawn by an artist? Let me explain briefly 10 inking techniques that I see over and over again that simply aren't going to take our drawings into the direction I'm sure we'd rather they go. And I'm going to show many of them at the expense of some of my drawings. The first one is what I call the heavy outline technique. And it always gives me the impression that perhaps they got a bit bored towards the end and just were going over the outline while wondering what to do next, or if in fact to do anything more. This is very common to see, but what we lose is the wonderful subtlety, the wonderful effects that we can create on edges, particularly on silhouette edges, which are particularly important for reading what's happening in our drawing. Number one, avoid heavy outlines. The second ink technique, which I think doesn't help our drawings at all, is to use straight continuous lines where we in fact have a textured edge. So for instance, this corner here, it would be really common to see it as a straight line. The same with here, and the same with here. And then there's every chance we would have a straight line here and here, a continuous line. And then probably for this edge in here and this edge in along here. Because if we look at our reference, we can certainly see marks that would encourage a straight line view of things. Probably this doorway and the window frames. But when we do that, we lose the opportunity to capture more realistically the effect of a somewhat jagged, serrated brick wall corner. And when we have an edging, but there's grass coming up against it, the shadows cast not a continuous straight ribbon of line, but the shadows create an almost random little jagged, serrated effect. We want to avoid continuous lines where we have textured edges. This third inking technique to be avoided is a bit related to the last one. It's for more irregular silhouettes, and that's to avoid a continuous outline of a fairly wiggly effect to capture very irregular forms, but particularly foliage. And I even see it in situations such as this. And while we all recognize what it is, the truth is it doesn't capture the reality, what we're actually seeing, nearly as much as actually considering what we're looking at and how we might tailor the actual individual marks we use for different parts of foliage across our drawing to create the best effect for that foliage in that position, in that light. This tree is so close and the leaves are so large in comparison at the distance, and they're fairly sparse, so we get much more of we see individual leaves, and so a little more effort to capture those individual leaves if I want to be true to my scene in my ink drawing technique. We'll do a few more without having to attack any of my drawings. This first inking technique to avoid is called feathering, which is simply, instead of drawing a continuous line, we draw lines that look like this. a bit like layered feathers. Usually this happens because we lack the confidence to do a continuous line, and we think if we do lots of small lines we can keep them straight and get a better overall look. But what we do get is something that looks very different to this. And unless we're drawing a bird, or I don't know, maybe a stuccoed Spanish mission house where we have all that kind of rendering on it, we probably don't want this feathered look. So if you find that you're feathering because you lack confidence, the only way to change this is to bite the bullet and start practicing continuous lines. Because the only way to learn a skill is to actually start to do it. Another very unhelpful technique to get into when we draw with pen is with hatching. Now with hatching we often do a lot of small lines quickly to create dark values. And we place them over the top of each other. What I often see though is marks that are turning into a continuous scribble line. Now this often comes, I think, from impatience and perhaps not realizing the impact it has. But every mark that we make on the paper creates an effect. The question is it creating the effect we want? And when we scribble, we end up getting all these loops that we don't get when we hatch. The loops only detract from the effect we're trying to create. And the other problem with scribbling is we tend to lose control because we're just doing it quickly to get it done. Every mark that we make has to be intentional. Even the ones that we make quickly for stylistic purposes still have to be intentional. For this next one, we have a tree trunk and the sun is coming from this direction. And what I often see is hatching that's been done in this way. And in a way, it does tell us that the light is coming from this direction. But compare the difference between this drawing and this one. Hatching marks have still been put on, but they've been put on in a direction that's sympathetic to the underlying form, the underlying three-dimensionality, the roundness of the tree. And as well, I've made some effort here to take the perspective of the tree into account. As round sections that move above eye level start to curve more as they go up or down away from eye level, but appear horizontal at eye level. I've made my marks more horizontal at the eye level position, and then they start to round slightly as they go up in one direction, or in the other direction they round more. How much more does this convey the roundedness of the tree than this? This is often done because this is what those oversimplified hatching videos that it's so easy to find have put on the side of a box with no explanation to create understanding that give us choices, but rather this is how you do it, now you know how to do it. No, hatching is a lot more complicated than that. I'll link my 10 different ways to use hatching as the end screen to this video if you're interested in more ways we can use hatching to create realistic effects with ink. For this next point, we'll go back to this scene. It's where we have areas such as this foliage, as well as outlining the edge. What we end up doing is creating a pattern. We do this because the thought of drawing all those leaves is overwhelming. So instead, to try and somehow capture something that feels a bit leafy, we do some sort of squiggly pattern. There are other sorts of patterns that can be done. I've seen ones that more look like this, that are more kind of blobby, that obviously take longer to do, but I don't think they're any more successful in terms of how they look. The thing that characterizes these patterns is it's basically the same over the whole area of foliage. But we end up with something that reminds me more of a still wool effect. And if we compare it with a more sensitively chosen series of marks, we can see what we're losing. This next inking technique is to avoid using lines that are all the same throughout our drawing. Look at these two boxes. Now, we know this box is moving away from us because the perspective angle tells us that. This box also tells us that it's moving away from us, both because of the perspective angles, but also because the line work in the second half has a lighter feel to it. That's not produced by changing pen, it's simply produced by changing my pressure in drawing it. We can see the same thing at work here. We have 3 trees all drawn with the same weight of line. But these trees have far more of a sense of stretching back behind each other because the weight of the line that I've used to draw them becomes lighter with each tree that's further away. We can create subtle effects that mimic how things look in real life by varying the weight of our line either from one object to another or even within the one object, particularly if it's a long object such as a building. And while we're talking about grass, let's be careful that we don't do the grass equivalent of these leaves with our inking and start to adopt the very cartoon-like symbol for grass, because this is in fact a symbol. Grass doesn't look like this, and yet we all know what it is when we see it. What usually happens is then the symbol starts getting scattered around wherever we have grass. And invariably, we don't foreshorten the grass. We don't make the grass clumps shorter and closer together as they move further away nearly enough. Think of the ground as a wall like this. It gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and so the grass that looks like this here is going to look like this here, and maybe just a few dots up here. And here are a few more that don't deserve more than a scrap of paper. The first is to avoid lines that are drawn slowly, methodically, with the fingers controlling the nib, with all the concentration on the nib. Now, that line's actually a bit straighter than I expected it to be, but we can see all the little wobbles that are in it. And we can see that a line that's briskly drawn, that's actually drawn not by moving my fingers along, but by moving my whole arm along, keeping my whole arm straight, quite rigid from the elbow to the fingers, and moving my whole arm gives me far more control. Now this speed gives me a lovely light line. If I want to, I can add marks to some of the line to create different effect, or I can get quite a lot of lines relatively close together with surprisingly little practice. And all of these things let me create different effects that I can't create with this. And I'll just add to this that the easiest way to get nice, smooth, long, straight lines is to hold the pen halfway down. If I take off the cap, you can see where I'm holding it. In fact, I have to have the cap on to be able to hold my pen the way I need to hold it to draw the lines I draw. The angle, nice, and if this is the paper, we don't want to be drawing like this, looking down, pressing down. We want the line at an angle that's more like this. Lets us have nice quick lines, which also give us more variation just by slowing down slightly or increasing the angle. So with the one pen, with the one 0.3, I can get these two different lines simply by learning to control the angle, the pitch of the pen, where I'm holding it, and the speed I draw with. But before we can learn to control our mark making, control the effects the ink puts on the paper, it's probably essential to realize the things that we might intuitively do that relate more to our childhood drawing experiences and memories than drawing as an adult, so that we can overcome those weaknesses at the same time as build the strengths that we're after for our ink drawing techniques. G'day, Stephen Travers here. Hope this was helpful. Please hit the like button if you haven't already, and all the best with your ink drawing and with developing the technique that you're after for the sorts of drawings you want to do. But whatever you do it, however you do it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.